Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Social Yet Distant podcast. My name is Jack Varnell, and I'm your host today. And today we got a great day. We got Christopher Owens, my friend from across the pond. And Christopher's got a new book we're going to talk about today. Let me tell you a little bit about Chris. He is influenced by post-punk industrial music, and he's evolving out of a hidden desire to be able to create anything. He exists in the moment between the conscious and the subconscious. After all, 2 years leading up to the apocalypse, it really needs to be documented. So here we are. Chris is also the author of Dethrone God, A Vortex of Securocrats, and has been published in Belfast, Punk Noir magazine, and Outcast Press, as well as authoring reviews for the Pensive Quill, Metal Ireland, Chordblossom, and The Quietus. All excellent publications you should know if you don't know. And hey, Chris, welcome to the Social Yet Distance this beautiful Sunday. How are you?
Not too bad, Jack. I'm glad to be back after our last time, which was actually about this time last year, if I remember correctly.
Well, I'm glad you remember because I can't remember what my last name is some days. So that's a good thing. Um, we are glad to have you, and I'm excited about the new book. I've started reading it. I'll be honest, I haven't completed it, but I'm intrigued by this young man, Gilbert, and I'd like to talk about the book. But let's hear a little bit first about, you mentioned that we met about a year ago and did a podcast about the other books. Let's talk a little bit about um, the history of your own history of writing, where that's brought you, and how it convalesces into this new book, and we'll talk more about that as well. But give us a little history.
Well, I've ever since I was a kid, I've always just enjoyed reading. And then I always just enjoyed, especially whenever you were in school, and the teacher would pick you to read out loud. I would always try and make it a bit more theatrical rather than just going, and Dino said this, and then he went to bed and all that sort of caper. So whenever I turned about 12, 13, there was a really magical period, not only just in terms of books, but also the culture of not just the north of Ireland, but also worldwide generally, where you had some, incredible films coming out. You had some incredible TV shows coming out. You had some incredible books. And it just made me think, I just felt really inspired. Like, there's something happening here. So that's whenever I first started writing. And, I actually found some of the stories a couple of months ago, and, they were pretty laughable by today, my standards today. But you have to start off somewhere. And so it was real, and it was just really nice because I could see the enthusiasm on the page, and half the time that's part of the battle because there are people who can write stuff that is very technical and very intricate, and whether they intend to or not, it can come across as a bit sterile. Whereas there's stuff that, although you may not you may think is a bit sloppy in certain areas, just oozes enthusiasm. So that's sort of that's carried over with me certainly. And then and then years later I met a writer called Bobby Walsh, another Belfast-based writer, who took me under his wing whenever I was 17. He had had a couple of things published in a couple of anthologies, and he really wanted to try and sort of try and make it in the industry in some shape or form. And then a number of years later he got a book published called Voices, which was a collection, it was a poetry anthology about just various things that had happened in his life and various points of view that he had. So he asked me to write the introduction to it, and so I wrote this poem about poetry being an industrial sort of thing. And that
Yeah.
was the first piece of writing I ever had published. That was in 2010. And then after that, because I'd been doing writing for so long, I'd started to get into other areas of interest with mainly music in terms of, putting on gigs, reviewing albums and stuff like that. So although I was still writing, the actual creative writing side took a bit of a back seat for a wee while. And then around the time of the first lockdown, I thought, you know what, it's now or never. I really need to start writing something. So the first thing I wrote was a series of poems, which then ended up being A Vortex of Securocrats. And there was a publisher called Nihilism Revisited, who I don't think is publishing anymore, but he had put out a couple of books by people like Craig Podmore and Philip Lopresti that I had read that I really liked, and I'd sent him the blurb for Vortex, and he said, "Yeah, this sounds really interesting," but afterwards he disappeared, and I don't know what happened to him. So then I sent it on to Craig at Close to the Bone, and he liked the idea because he had been a former British soldier who actually served in the north of Ireland during the recent conflict. And so that was the first thing. And then that led to me meeting Zach Ferguson, who then obviously he's now a filmmaker, but at that point he had Sweat Drenched Press going on, and he published some stuff that I really liked, not only his own work, but also people like Marcus Meltdown and RG Van Neck, who's I can never pronounce his surname, so sorry if I've got that wrong. And so he put out Dethrone God, that, and both Craig and Zach did a brilliant job with it. But now I've decided to start my own publishing company, so it's Down by Law Books. And so the first title is the new one. So it was just called Soineanta Maskirovka, and now available. And it's my first step into self-publishing. So all three, it's been a series of learning events, just from starting to write at the age of 13 to meeting someone who is actually a published writer, to becoming a published writer, to then having a book of poetry by yourself, a full book by yourself, and then putting out a book by yourself. So it's been a long process. It's been over 25 years, but it's been worth it.
Yeah, it sounds like the trajectory has been pretty quick and straight up. Um, you mentioned a couple of names. I know Zach pretty well.
Yes, you've had him on the podcast, haven't you?
Yeah, Zach's been here, and he's doing some really interesting things these days. So, audience out there, if you would, like, subscribe, and come back and visit us. Make sure you see the podcast with Zach Ferguson as well. Um, Craig Podmore, you mentioned him. Now that's a name I have not heard in a long time, and I don't know why that is. And the other thing is, I don't believe I was aware he was from Ireland.
He's not.
Oh, he's not.
No, he's from Manchester, as far as I'm aware.
Okay, okay. Well,
Through just through reading and stuff like that, I had discovered his work, and especially, I suppose I should mention this as well. One of the other big factors was a guy called Philip Best, who used to be in a band called White House, but he has his own act, Consumer Electronics. He started up his own little publishing company called Amphetamine Sulfate, and he was putting out stuff like for people like Matthew Bauer from Skullflower, Gary Mundy from Ramley, and all that sort of stuff. And I really liked the stuff that he was putting out. So I was recommended Craig's stuff along the same sort of line, and that's how I discovered that, and that's how I discovered Philip's stuff as well. So shout out to Philip.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. That's amazing. That's amazing. I mean, I can't even tell you the last time I even thought or heard Podmore's name. That's amazing. I'm definitely going to look him up. What was this press you said?
Well, he's got a new book out at the moment. He's because I just reviewed it there a wee while ago, and but I'll send you on his details afterwards. Sure.
Yeah, yeah, do that. Yeah, please do, and then I'll share it with the audience as well. Cool. All right. So tell us about this new book. I mean, I have read about half of it, and it it's a journey. That's the word. Pick one word. It's a journey, but I don't know enough about that journey and where it's going yet to be authoritative about it. So tell me a little bit more about the formation of this book and the thought behind it, and y- I don't want you to tell me too much.
Of course, of course. Want
'Cause
people to read the thing after all. But
but I'm always, and I'm sure the audience is always interested as well. With the formulation of such an idea and how it becomes what it is. So let's talk about that a little bit, and let's start with the name, okay?
okay, well, the name is a sort of mix up because it's two words. One Soineanta, which is an Irish word meaning innocent, and Maskirovka, which is Russian, meaning pretender. So it literally translates as innocent pretender. Now, the reason why it is called that is, well, there's a couple of reasons. Firstly, I want to have a system in place where whenever you Google the names of my books, that's the first thing that comes up on Google, because there's too many times whenever, so many people have similar titles, or in some cases, the exact same title. So then people get confused. So I want to be no ambiguity. You type in Soineanta Maskirovka, there's only one book with that name on it, and it's mine. Secondly, it was a kind of a little sort of description of the character of Gilbert, I find. And also thirdly as well, I think it's also, well, I personally like to think it's also a sly bit of social commentary, because especially around the time whenever I had started I'd writing the book, one thing that I always remembered was during the early days of the Russia invading Ukraine, and obviously the Ukrainians fighting back. One thing you started to see an awful lot of people doing was canceling uh, performances or artists who were Russian. So, for example, you would have things like, like Russian ballets or whatever would be cancelled in London, and then they would be keen to promote a Ukrainian piece of art. And I'm all for obviously people prefer promoting different forms of art and different periods and all that, but it always just it sort of ties in with this whole notion now where culture is political. Now I know there's that old saying that the personal is political. I think that's kind of been a bit overdone in recent years. So it's because I think it's got to a stage now where just things are so interchangeable that you never take things as they are, as a piece of work. You have to see them purely through a political lens. And I think that's a great shame because you miss out so many things. So there was a commentary about that in the sense of, you know, especially Maskarova, because obviously, as you can guess, that's where the word mask comes from. So even though we think it's an English word, it actually comes from Russia. So that was a little commentary in the idea that, you can cancel this stuff all you want, but at the end of the day, it's part of the basis of the language that you speak. And then also as well, it's taken on a slightly different resonance in recent times, because you've probably seen with that dickhead Conor McGregor going to the White House and meeting Trump, and he's talking about, too many immigrants in Ireland or whatever. And I mean that's a whole different argument in itself. But one thing is that a lot of a lot of things that people think are foreign or whatever actually become quite normalized quite quickly. So, for example, if you think about curry and chips on a Friday night after you've gone to the pub, you never think, well, like, that's from, the curry is from India or whatever. And the same way, if you go to get a kebab, you don't think that doesn't come from, wherever. It's just part of it's just part of your night out. It's just part of the culture. So part of it is that these things get assimilated so quickly that it just becomes perfectly normal. So that's the what I was trying to put across, certainly. And I think the Irish context, unfortunately, is quite, well, it's quite unfortunate, especially in recent times. But ultimately, that's what the title was. So it's a mixture of sheer promotional sort of tactics and social commentary.
Yeah, I think it's genius. And it from the parts that I've read up to this point, it definitely describes um, the journey, I guess. But the direct correlation with today's times, and not only today's, but historically as well. Um, for example, the world wars, the troubles, um, civil war in the US, those kind of things, all of those things are for, are rolling backwards so quickly. It's almost like shock to me. Everything that I imagined was progress in my lifetime is slowly being taken away one at a time. And the scary part to me is that it really is as if people have just been brainwashed and they accept it and they don't feel any motivation other than to roll with the punches. and there's not a fight mentality as strong as it probably should be in order to prevent what's coming if we don't, because history shows us. And I think what's important about a book like yours is that it brings it down to an individual level. And I think that the journey as a metaphor is real apropos because here we are, we're all on this journey, and we can either go in the same directions or we could all go in separate directions and bump into each other all the time. And I think we're bumping into each other all the time right now. And it's a matter of reorganization and going back to uh, our more inane instincts as opposed to the ones that we've been fed or brainwashed with throughout our lives. Does that make sense at all?
It does, yeah, certainly. And I think that's going, people going in different directions and bumping into each other, I don't think is necessarily a bad thing because I think ultimately, that's how we, that's how humanity discovers things by people going off the beaten track and trying different things and maybe they fail sometimes, maybe they succeed. I think what just worries me is the fact that, as you say, that people, because of pretty much arguably since about the sort of the 2008 recession, you've just had, two generations who have been let, and now three generations with Generation Alpha coming up soon. They've been just sort of left on the scrap heap where they've just had to fight constantly for jobs. Because, whenever you hear people talk about jobs, like in like the 80s and 90s, of course, people had their problems. But generally, one thing people always said was that it felt like, you were part of a community in some regard where it wasn't just you just turning up to the factory doing your shift and going. There was a sense of community there through labor unions, through just people just working together in the same place for years on end. But
Right.
now in the last 20 odd years that's not really been possible because there's been an awful lot of gaps and sort of restrictions placed on wages in certain regards. Like there, and for me personally, I've been through a couple of jobs in that time, and it's always, and although there have been a variety of reasons why I've left, one of the main reasons is because that I cannot reach any higher. I've just hit that ceiling, so to speak, within that particular company. So it's time to move on. And I mean, on one hand, that sort of creates a certain sort of hustle culture, which which is another reason why I think why millennials and Gen Zers or Zers as you Americans say like to sort of will use YouTube and TikTok as ways of of what they call a side hustle because they've had no choice. They've had to do that for so many years. But at the same time as well, whatever happened to the notion about, because it used to be a stereotype, but I mean, you always used to say, films where a guy worked in a factory and he had a wife and three kids, and okay, they maybe didn't have the most comfortable life in the world, but he could feed his kids, he could pay the bills, and he could take the family on holiday once a year as long as he saved okay. I mean, that sort of lifestyle, which used to be a working class lifestyle, and I mean, in America, you guys would call it a middle class lifestyle. That's pretty much gone now, and it's now both parents have to work, and so as a result, you end up with the sort of atomization of society, and then the state sort of then has to come in and look after things because the parents are obviously off doing their own thing, so they don't have time or maybe the inclination to sort of raise their kids because they're just doing so much work just barely to survive. So then they put the kids in schools or nurseries, and then it's up to the teachers to not civilize but teach the kids a certain way, which is why you've had a backlash in the US in certain schools where certain thing, parents haven't liked certain things that their kids have been taught. Now you can argue till the ducks come home about whether that's appropriate or not. Whether is it right for parents to be able to say no, hang on, my kid should not be taught this or whatever. But it does speak to a gradual breakdown of society, which I think is why, as you say, there's no real fight left in people anymore. And if they are fighting, they're fighting over the wrong things, in my opinion. They think that they're fighting some sort of how would you describe it? Some sort of sort of left over from the 1930s. And there's no doubt that Trump definitely ticks some of those boxes, but it's something completely new, and it's something completely out of the box in a way as well. So that's why I think people have resorted to using cliches just regarding these sort of circumstances, because they sound familiar, but realistically it's almost a completely new situation, and we're still struggling to get our head around it.
Yeah, it's absolutely, and it's universal. What's going on here in the U.S., I mean, is so unbelievable and counter to anything I ever thought was even possible, you know, in this country. Or that a leader could get in place that has such motives, you know.
Hmm.
Um, but that's the way it is, and it's done through fractionalizing people, causing dissension amongst people, and eventually it does spread out to the point where everybody feels like they're fighting on their own, and it's a war. It's not just they're going to win some fight. It feels like a war because it's never ending.
Yeah, and
No,
it's also like,
well, and I've been trained to believe that there's a winner and there's a loser, and that's it. And if you're not the winner, you lose. And by God, I'm going to win. I'm not going to be a loser, you know.
yeah.
And
But
that's
also at the same time, you can also argue as well, it's a kind of postmodern war as well, because the battle lines aren't as clearly defined as, some cases, as other wars. And what constitutes being a winner and being a loser is also not as clearly well defined as well. Some of the sort of the recent battles that we've seen over the years, um, in terms of, culture, whatever. I mean, that's, and in some cases politics as well, has let whenever I look at some of them, I just think, really, is there really any need for that? But then when you hear the people speak about it, whether they're pro or anti, whatever the battle is, they're so fervent and they're so passionate that, you can't help but, realize that it does actually mean something to these people. But I mean, maybe this is just me speaking as an outsider, just viewing all this sort of stuff. But as I say, it feels that we're kind of in uncharted terrain in a way, where we're still trying to figure out things, and we think we have a grasp on things, but we don't completely. And in many ways, that's quite interesting terrain to explore, certainly as a writer. Because I remember being asked a while ago, would I ever write a historical novel, or one that was, based in Belfast during the recent conflict. And I would never rule out the idea, but at the same time as well, I always think the present is the most interesting time to write, because there's so much going on, there's so many possibilities, there's so many roads that you can take, that it's fun to really explore that. And also, anyways, with novels and books in general, they should be, they should be timeless, but they should also capture their time as well. Where, if you take my favorite film of all time is RoboCop, I just love that film. I just think it is a masterpiece as far as I'm concerned. It's very much a timeless film, because there's so many things about, there's existentialism going on in there, there's human drama, there's religious imagery going on in there. At the same time, it's also an action adventure, and there's sci-fi, there's a comedy, but it's also very much about a very specific period in time, which of course is the Reagan era of America,
right.
where you had yuppies sort of competing for with big business, and thinking, reading all these sort of Japanese books and thinking that they're all killers and all that sort of stuff. But at the same time, it still resonates perfectly today. So that's why ultimately I think, it is good to write about what you know. I mean, speculative fiction is great, great for what it is, but I think it was I can't remember who it was, but they basically said that they'd pretty much given up on writing it, because the future has pretty much come and gone now. We just sort of live in this sort of effervescent now, which is almost like it's like purgatory. You don't know, it's just you're there, you just exist. One thing is, you've got the past, you don't really have a defined future, you don't really have a defined past, because some people consider the past to be problematic in various regards, which obviously it is. But I think ultimately you have to have some sort of sense of past and future, because without a past you can't draw upon something to move to the future. And if you don't have a future, you have nothing to do, you have nothing to motivate you and think, well, what's going on, which is possibly another reason why a lot of people don't have any fight left in them just simply because they're just sort of stuck in this ether well of nothingness and don't see any positivity either in the past or the future to inspire them.
Agreed, agreed, agreed. Absolutely. So, how does all this relate to the book?
Well, the main character in the book, Gilbert Hood, is a 70-year-old gentleman who has just been retired or, has retired from his job, depending on your point of view. And it's basically about how he's trying to motivate, trying to sort of circumvent his life because people often talk about retirement in the sense that, you know, oh, you get a new lease of life and all that sort of caper, and obviously a lot of people do, but there are people who have, their whole going back to what I was saying about some people who, who've worked in the same place for 40 odd years and feel a real kinship once they leave that and then they realize that was their whole life, they think, well, what do I do now? So with Gilbert, he has clearly defined interests in that he's very interested in the movies. That's why he has a YouTube channel where he talks about classic films. He is very sort of reverential towards his grandparents, and he's also very interested just generally in sort of history. And these are areas which fascinate him, but at the same time they can also lead him down sort of potentially dark paths as well. And so obviously you'll have to read the book to find out for yourself exactly how it works out for him. But there's always it's this idea of the unknown. You've come towards, you're closer, you get a certain age, you're closer to death than what you were, say, 10 years ago. You're not a young man anymore. So how do you sort of, but you still have a sort of enthusiasm and a curiosity. How do you sort of circumvent that? So that's how it sort of fits in with the book.
Yeah, I think it's an excellent premise, and I think it's right on track. Um, Not only in its content, but I think the context and the timing um, for that type of tale seems valuable to me. I think, we talked earlier about the idea of being brainwashed, and I don't know that that's an appropriate analogy for here, but we follow a path, and it it either goes one direction or the other, or we see it some way that it's supposed to go, and we chase that. And the idea is to walk away with good enough memories, I guess, and good times in the process. Um, I don't know if Gilbert's going to find that or not.
Well, so well, I mean, you're halfway through it, so you've undoubtedly encountered at least one incident that may have sort of shaken his faith in one or two things. But then, that sometimes these things can be good for you in a way because having your faith shaken in certain ways makes you reevaluate things and makes you think, do you want to try certain things that you may never have
Yeah,
experienced before?
I agree 100%. And anything that instills that or sparks that in somebody is a beautiful thing as far as I'm concerned. And that's really the nature of why some of us write, is to impart that to the next guy, and they can do whatever they want with it.
Absolutely. Ultimately writing, whether it's you putting down a couple of lines of poetry or writing a full novel or writing a script or even just, saying a couple of things that you've just thought about and just recording them and uploading them to TikTok, that's you expressing yourself at a particular moment in time. Now, it may not be the most articulate expression. It may not be, dare I say, the most quote unquote relevant expression. I fucking hate that term whenever it comes to, because I have this thing. I always remember years ago whenever Public Enemy put out an album in 2007. It's called "How You Sell Soul to a Soulless Soul Who Sold Their Soul." Typical Public Enemy. They never have good titles. And I really like the album. I still think it's really good. But I remember when it came out, I had loads of people who knew who were into hip hop who dismissed it. They basically said they're not relevant anymore. And I never liked that because to me, whenever if you're talking about relevance, that to me, that's like something that you do in terms of sport. You can say, like, for example, Michael Jordan was the number one basketball player for a while, but he's not relevant anymore because he's
Right.
retired now or whatever. It always seemed to be very sport based, this idea that there was winners and losers, sort of kind of what you were saying a wee while ago about certain aspects of war. And so as a result, when it came to art and literature and music, I never liked that term being expressed because these things change so much. And I was validated about 5 years later because there's a track from the album called Harder Than You Think, and it was used for the 2012 Olympics, and it got to number 5 in the UK charts. And I went, I see, I fucking knew it. So as I say, so things may not be the most relevant in that particular moment, but at the end of the day, it is you expressing yourself in some shape or form, and some people may react badly to it, some people may react well to it, some people may not react at all. But the fact that you're getting those reactions and you're getting your voice out there to people is a key thing.
Exactly, exactly right. And I was taught long ago that if I give you a gift, it's not really my business what you do with it. You know, if you want to turn around and give it to somebody else, fine. If you want to take it and throw it in the trash, fine. Because my job is to give the gift, you know,
Yeah,
and I think that we all do that. Hopefully we all try to do that anyway.
absolutely, yes. Especially when it does come to writing, because so many things. There's so many factors, and sometimes it's also just pot luck as well, whether you actually get noticed or not, or whether people respond to something. Because how many times have you tried reading something, and for whatever reason you haven't been in the mood, you're tired or whatever, so it doesn't click with you, and then you try it about 3 months later, whenever you're in a slightly better mood, and you just think, this is amazing, this is the best thing I've ever read.
Hmm. Yeah, I have that happen all the time. I found a notebook hidden away in a well, I'll say notebook. It was a folder on my computer that I hadn't looked at. It was in an online storage place I had, and I had put a bunch of my writing there and called it a master file. Like, I don't know, if it was probably 10 years ago, and it was all the stuff that I hadn't seen it in years. And some of it is pretty good. So, I love treasure troves like that, but.
Yeah, there's nothing quite like whenever you find something that you've written and years and you can read back and go, you know what, that's still pretty damn good. Because especially as a writer, you're always critical of what you do, and you're always constantly thinking about, can you improve this? Can you improve that? I mean, if I had my way, I'd probably still be editing A Vortex of Securocrats to this day. So
Exactly.
the fact that I had to have a sort of deadline meant that's it, it's out in the world. But when you look back and you go, yeah, that's pretty damn good actually. There's not a feeling quite like it.
Well, and book sales and how many other people are reached by those words isn't what's important at that moment. What at that moment, I am an artist, I've created my art, and I'm proud of it. Okay, whatever happens after that that's the rest of the story. But the task has been accomplished as a writer, in my opinion. I've said what I needed to say, and that's the part that must happen for anybody to ever hear anything is, we have to say what needs to be said, and people have to, read it or hear it or understand it, and not even necessarily agree or disagree. Even debate would be great, you know. And
Yes, absolutely.
I think your writing style kind of invites that to some degree.
Oh,
It's
thank you.
definitely that thought-provoking faith questioning that you mentioned. I constantly question my beliefs, and am I putting my energy in the right place? And is my mode are my motives selfish, or I'm being self-driven here? What's the purpose? So I'm constantly thinking of that. But as an outsider looking in, a prompt like your book would definitely spin that off into my head.
Oh, thank you very much. That's always nice to hear.
Wait till I finish the sucker.
And then you'll come back and go, that was a load of crap.
Yeah, but see, that'll be private. I
Right.
would never do that. It's art and it's to be judged on by the individual. And a lot of people don't like my writing. That's just the way it is. So I realized if I'm going to make a living around writing, I'll have to write to do it, but I don't necessarily have to do it about my writing. There's plenty of great writing out there that I enjoy that other people need to be enjoying as well. So that's kind of why we're here. So,
Absolutely. And it's a shame that the whole sort of potential, line of people actually making a living from writing isn't quite the same as it was, even 30 odd years ago because, you think about, I mean, it's something I kind of struggle with a little bit because even though I have a full-time job and a part-time job as well, I still obviously try and write as much as possible, but because I've obviously got other commitments, it means then I don't have the full time to really devote to it what I could. So it's basically just bits and pieces here and there.
right,
Whereas if someone came along and basically said to me, "Okay, I will give you a monthly stipend of X amounts of pounds, which will cover your bills and your food and everything. All you basically just have to do is write."
right,
That I would quite like that, but at the same time as well. I could also probably, because one thing I've also found as well is that a lot of writers just hate writing. They love the actual thought about writing and they love the aftermath, but actually the mechanical process of sitting down and trying to come up with words or phrases to sum up a particular area of the book that they're in that they absolutely hate. So then they come up with excuses and then go off and do something else. And I have a feeling that if that was to be me, if someone said, "Okay, I'll cover all your bills. You just write the best thing you can. I'll make excuses and go off elsewhere." So sometimes it's a bit of it's a double-edged sword because on one hand, as I say, it would be really nice, and it means then you could probably, in theory, if you were disciplined, you could write an awful lot more, or you could be a bit more expansive with your work. You could take it into different areas that you maybe wouldn't necessarily think of. But at the same time as well, there is something to be said for limitations because if you're told, like I say, with a vortex, I was told basically, okay, this is the deadline. After that, you're not getting another one. So I had to get everything ready, make sure it was it made sense before shipping it in. Whereas, I say if it was all just sort of free flowing, I might never have done it.
right. Yeah, I can definitely relate to that. And I have found too with my own writing that when the deadline exists, I do better, and my writing's actually better. Um, but it's not artistic things that I'm talking about. I'm talking about maybe I'm writing for a job, maybe I'm doing a blog post for 40 bucks, or whatever the case might be. Um, there's definitely a lot of writing in my world, but I'm not always, I spend as much time cleaning up my old work that has never seen the light than I do writing new stuff. Um,
And why is that, do you think?
because I feel like what I have is not finished. I think I jot notes all the time, but I don't like of current events and things that happen today. In today's world. Um, but what goes in today's world goes at the end of the story I've been telling in all my writing all along, you know. So I mean, from one book, if it was to be books, from one to the next, to the next, to the next, would basically be to some degree an organized layout of what has transpired in my life. So
Hmm.
until I get up to this point where I feel like it needs to be and done with, I'm not feeling that same fire. It's me not making time is the bottom line. I know what the problem is, and I accept that at this point. Um, but I'm also a creature of habit. I get struck by something, and you never know. That has happened too. I mean, it's probably wrong to say I haven't written anything new. It's just I don't make the time to sit down and do it. If it hits me, I write it down. You know what I mean? Most of the time, I'll take it through to some end. So anyway, so Let's sell your book, not mine.
Well, I mean, stuff like that. I'm always fascinated by how other writers, what they call the process, but just simply because so many people have different processes. And because what I hope to do, I mean, I'm currently working on another book at the moment, which hopefully, fingers crossed, will be out by February next year. Although, well, that's to be confirmed anyway.
Right.
There's an old I can't remember who once again who said it, but someone said basically, if you spend basically about the equivalent of 10 hours a day working on your craft for 10 years, that means then you become a master at what you do. And I was thinking about that about the writer Billy Childish. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he's a musician as well. He has literally about 300 studio albums, and there's a garage in there, there's blues, there's punk rock, there's everything. And he's also a prolific writer. He's written probably once again about 300 books, and he's also a painter as well, an artist. Not just a painter and decorator, but and some of his work now sells for like 10, 15,000 pounds. But he's someone who's been doing that every day pretty much since about 1981. He has this little area that he's been renting literally since about 1981, where he just goes in, he treats it like a factory job. He just goes in, he writes, he plays music, he does painting, and then by the end of the week, he maybe has a new studio album or a new book or a new painting. And that sort of meant, and to say with Marky Smith of the Fall to a certain extent as well, where it's basically, every year or so just hit them with something, because then that way you end up getting into a rhythm and you can see. Because one thing I often, especially when it comes to music, you find that, especially because nowadays with bands, especially bands that are on big, either big indies or major labels, they'll put out an album and then they tour it for about 2 or 3 years. Then there's a gap year where they write the new album, and then the next album comes out. So there's about 4 years. And so as a result, there's in that period you could maybe have put out about two or three other things. Now, whether they would be any good or not, it's a different matter. But it's all about progression, as a writer, and also just wanting to put out stuff constantly. So as a result, fans can see, we can not only get more stuff from you, but they can also see how you're progressing as well, rather than waiting. And then because there's so much expectation on, there's been 4 years since the last one, and then if it turns out to be a dud, then people don't necessarily get it because you've changed direction so much that it could alienate the fan base. Whereas if you've just gradually been putting out work over the years, people can then say, well, he did that thing, he did this sort of direction about 2 or 3 books ago, so it's probably no surprise that he ended up going fully in that direction. So you can play about with people's expectations. You can just get more stuff out there. You can just grow as an artist by just constantly just working. So that's really what I hope to do and what I plan to do. But other writers, can sometimes will just sit and write, up something for about 6 months, refine it, and so it's kind of like what you've just said there in terms of some of your own stuff. And that if that works for them and they feel that that really helps represent what they do, then fair play to them as well.
Right. Well, I think that, like in thinking about my own writing, I definitely have a unique process. It's probably very different than most people. And part of the source of that is, or part of the components or byproducts of that is I don't feel the drive that some people feel, or the motivation to actually sit down and create. And it's because I started writing. I mean, I've always written from as long as I can remember. Um, and I just enjoyed writing. Um, you know, I I learned along the way that I needed to be journaling in my recovery life. I learned that I needed to be journaling a little bit better to stay in touch with my feelings. And I didn't know how to do that, so I started writing stories about things that happened in my life. And so as the years went by, I got very bored with that, and I started going back and cutting and pasting stuff out of it and reworking things and putting the pieces in place where they belong and saying what I was trying to say in a journal in a fashion that doesn't read like a journal, um, which is unfortunate because most of my stuff reads like it came from a journal. But but that's the tool that started it all for me. And the practice that started it all for me was I got intrigued by poetry and having some poetry friends, started reading a bunch of poetry. And I thought, man, I've got all this stuff. Let me start going through it and let's see what I can do. And I wrote a bunch of stuff. And, it would be a lie to say I don't write new things. I don't usually put them out there because I've shaved and modified and melded all of these words up to date into a certain form, and I'm almost happy with it. And when that happens, who knows what the creative flow will bring. When I've got more time to sit down and read, I have more time to sit down and write. Actually, I get better and better um, inspired. Um, it's and I need a different environment to read than I live in. I just don't get the peace here to have the comprehension I need or the philosophical message that might be coming through the words that I hope to receive from any reading is, some sort of learning. So that's kind of how that process developed. And there's probably not many that do it that way. I also didn't go to college. I don't have any, extended um, English training or writing abilities or classes or anything like that. So, which would always probably be a good idea. I take plenty of workshops. That's not a thing, but um, anyway, I get what you're saying, and I would love to be able to have that lifestyle as well. Um, I just because then I could isolate. And it's like I told you earlier offline that, my goal is that this machine, socially at distance, runs on its own by having the right amount of subscribers, the audience that is intrigued by what we offer, and they keep coming back. And my words will get out through that medium one way or the other, and that medium will grow and allow people like you and the many, many other authors that have come through and talk about their work and share that same enthusiasm with the rest of the world um, that I sometimes have over my own work. And I don't know, man, you're doing good stuff. That's all I could tell you.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you. It's been a long sort of process, and I mean, because people often, there's that whole thing about, instant over. It took 12 years for an overnight fame, basically. And while it certainly hasn't been 12 years, and certainly hasn't been overnight fame on my regard, it does feel like slowly but surely I am building up a bit of a profile. I have the people have certainly bought the books. People have been very complimentary about them, and maybe, as I say, in another number of years, once I become a bit of a regular face, it's people will then start to think, okay, right, he's someone I need to keep an eye out for, which would be nice. I think it's just the problem is that because everything is so decentralized at the moment in terms of not only just in terms of the culture, but also just in terms of reading habits as well. It's a much harder to get your work out there. It's not impossible, obviously. Well, I'll rephrase that. It's not that it's impossible to get your work out there. It's more impossible to get your work heard by a larger audience because some bookshops, will only order from, big distributors. So if you walk in with a couple of copies of your book, they may not take them because you have to go through a distributor. And
Right.
obviously that's the shop's prerogative, or else sometimes just the audience that the sort of person who goes to the shop may not be interested in what I do. That's in because I've read various people have tried that over the years and they felt personally rejected, and so I've been sort of it's put them out ever so slightly. So that's why they just stick to ebooks because there's not quite the same problem. There's not that's not quite the same sort of issue. And I mean, I don't really want to tell people, that's, what their process, if what they do is wrong or anything. But to me, part of the thing is actually getting out there and making connections with people, whether it be, someone who's picked up the book just simply because they like the cover or they were intrigued by the title, or maybe they'd read, a review of, say, Dethrone God, uh, that the one that Dennis Cooper did, and or maybe they've heard this podcast and went, you know what, let's give this a go. It's those little human connections that make you sort of not only appreciate people who've actually gone out of your way to read your stuff, but it also means then that whenever you do, hopefully you do get a slightly bigger audience and you do get people who are actively waiting to see what your next work is going to be. It means then that you don't take them for granted because you know exactly that they were there for you at a certain period of time, and you obviously highly appreciate what they bring to you and how they read your work. And it's in that sense, it's always, how would you describe it? It's always very humbling, and it's always interesting to see why exactly they picked up on you in a different way, and you don't necessarily get that through ebooks.
Right. Yeah, that's very true. And that's one piece to my picture that I don't have filled as much as I'd like. And that's actually getting out into public spaces where people are performing poetry. And I'm not, believe me, I don't have stage fright. So it would not be, beyond my reach to jump up on stage even. Um, I'm in an environment right now where that's just not feasible for me to be able to do that, for a number of different reasons, but mainly because it's just not local. You know, I would have to travel some distance to get involved in a poetry community that is somewhat regular and dedicated. So I don't, I'm not in London or Atlanta or Los Angeles or, the Oakland people. There's little pockets throughout the states where people kind of, there's a group of poets from Ohio, for example, and everybody knows who they are. And um, I just have never experienced that to the degree that I would like to, because I feel like it would motivate me in different directions and definitely inspire me, because I know how jazzed I get just from reading other people's poetry. So, um, appreciating the arts as a whole, to see a person read their work or call it acted out, whatever you want to call it, um, can only be that much more powerful, I think, in my case. So,
Absolutely. Although sometimes I question the whole, when people have to talk about, like not clique is the wrong word, but whenever you do have sort of group, poetry groups or whatever, because I was in one or two myself whenever I was in Queen's University. One was taken by a lady called Maeve McGuckin, who's quite a well-known poet herself, and the other one was a guy called Ian Sampson, who's he's English, but he has written several books. I think mainly not sort of crime fiction, if memory serves. And the groups themselves were great because people would be given feedback and all that and all their stuff. But the other thing is, I think sometimes there's a certain conformity that people feel that they have to, you know, conform to a certain style of writing in order to get praise from that particular group. And one of the things it is quite hard, and especially if you are a writer, is you have to be able to stand by your work 100%. So if you say, and especially when you're young, whenever you see people who are already established and they're going, oh, well, I'm not too sure about this particular line or whatever, you can't help but sometimes be influenced by that. But at the same time as well, sometimes, even if they genuinely mean well, sometimes they don't necessarily get what you're trying to do. And so they're trying to offer suggestions, but it almost fits into their sort of worldview, which isn't your worldview. So as a result, it's almost like, I mean, I always think about John Kennedy Toole, who wrote obviously A Confederacy of Dunces and the Neon Bible, and he submitted a Confederacy of Dunces to um, this editor in New York who'd done very well on Catch 22, and the guy read the book and said that he really enjoyed it, but he didn't think it had a point, quote unquote. And
mm,
they went back and forth for a couple of years, and eventually Toole took the manuscript back and then obviously killed himself. And then years later, Confederacy of Dunces was published and won the Pulitzer Prize. And meanwhile, that editor, whose name I cannot remember now, I had his note name a wee while ago, but he said himself that years later he went back and actually reread it. And while he still enjoyed it, he didn't see the point in it. Because to him, the books have to have a purpose. So, but then the whole thing is, if you put in something, if they end up with the book having a purpose, you ruin the whole point of a Confederacy of Dunces. So
Right.
sometimes with people who have say opposing points of view on certain things, even if they do genuinely mean well in their suggestions, it may be completely wrong for the style that you're doing. So therefore, you have to kind of resist that. I mean, it got to the stage whenever I was in Queens with Maeve McGuckin, she would read my stuff, and what she would just say is, "It's very you," which basically means it's crap, but I can tell that you wrote it. And I mean, you can take that what it is, but I mean, you can also say that that's quite a compliment to be able to say, "I know that you wrote that. That's clearly your style. So you've got your own thing down to a T." And sometimes you have to exist in that regard because or sometimes you are fighting you're sort of, you're swimming against the tide, and you have to sort of carry on in that direction. And then, maybe 10, 15 years later, people, who have grown up with your stuff, hopefully, then come round and say, and then become influential themselves and say, no, actually, this this stuff that you slagged off at the time, that actually set a new standard. I mean, obviously, I'm just, this would be stuff. It would be nice if people said that about my work. Obviously, I don't hold out any great hopes for it, but it's just sometimes with people who, especially because they see things like Dead Poets Society or whatever, and they think, wow, that's how it should be. But sometimes it's better when it's just yourself writing away.
Yeah, there's a big ongoing argument about outlaw poets versus, the academics. And, and to me, it's all labels. It's all bullshit.
Yeah.
I mean, I understand the need to classify some of the work in certain ways and times, but the labels are what cause the problem. If I've decided I want to be an academic and get my payoff comes from being successful in that environment, then so be it. But if I'm riding around on my Harley from place to place and standing on some rusty can somewhere and yelling poetry at the world, so be it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
They're both poetry. I don't care what you call it. And they're both outlaw. I don't care what you call it. And it's both academic. I don't care what you call it, you know. And I think
Hmm.
that's a lot of the time that's what part of the problem is. I have lived through Facebook poetry wars more than once, you know, and
Can
it's
you can you just imagine just the absolute carnage of that statement? Facebook poetry wars.
no, but everybody knows it's true. You'll watch it happen. I don't see it coming now because people have diversified some, but when Facebook was the only place to go and you could write notes and there was lots of poetry and stuff, that same competition that you might feel on a stage somewhere or for a slot in the library or something like that, those same
Hmm.
people, are the same ones. So, again, it's the labels. Who cares, man? If the stuff's good and it deserves to be out there, then let's put it out there and
Absolutely.
do it for that reason. And you can learn from whatever the feedback is, good, bad, ugly, and different. You find out what you're doing that's right. You find out what's doing you're doing that's wrong. You find out where you need to, you get a comment like, "Oh yeah, I know it's so you." You know what that means, and you know what you need to do. It's valid. She taught you well. At the same time, sucks to hear it.
Well, especially whenever you're young and you're still trying to find your own voice, and you're still, there's a part of you that, even though you profess not to care what people think, there's still a part of you that's looking approval from your from academics, or certainly your peers. And it takes an awful long time, and it takes a little bit of deprogramming to not think like that. I mean, obviously, to a certain extent, we all still think like that. But I think whenever you're young, and going back to the story that well, I'll tell you, I'll censor the story for for this particular section of the podcast. But whenever I was 18, I was in a creative writing group, and the teacher was a lady called Jo Egan, who is sadly no longer with us. She died in a car crash on Christmas Eve 2022, if memory serves. She was a lovely lady, and she did an awful lot of work with the Jewish community in Ireland, and just also with just being just general creative writing. Just running classes for beginners or people who've been doing it a long time, and just mainly use it as a sort of way to vent for whatever reason. But in December 2004, when I was 18, she organized a reading in the Linen Hall Library in Belfast, which is quite a prestigious library.
Mm.
And I went down there with a load of other people from the class who were a mixture. I mean, I was the youngest in the class, but there were people there, who were in their 40s, 50s, who made sort of housewives who had just started writing little bits here and there. And this would have been the first time that they'd actually read their stuff in public. And it was quite a decent little crowd. There was about 50 people there, and one of them was Colin Bateman, who is quite a well-known writer, certainly in the north of Ireland. He's famous for a novel called Divorcing Jack, which was turned into a film about 20, actually nearly 30 years ago. And he sat in the front row, and there was another person who sat in the front row, who's quite famous. So I get up and read. I remember looking out at the audience, and at the very least, people looked like they were vaguely interested, or at least pretending to look like they were vaguely interested. Apart from this one particular famous person who just looked like he was nodding off, like he had his eyes closed and his head was slumped and his arms were folded. And I went, "You bastard!" But at the same time, I had to carry on reading. I couldn't let him put me off, so I did so. And then afterwards, Colin Bateman came up and he was very nice to me. He was very complimentary about my reading and some of the stuff that I was writing. And he was doing that with other people. That was genuinely encouraging. And then this particular person, who I'll not name, then got up and started slagging off. And he announced who he was. And then I realized who the person was. And then he started slagging off another writer because he didn't come down to this particular reading because the writer had said he wouldn't get out of bed for anything less than, like, I think it was £1,000 in those days. And
Uh,
I couldn't really figure out what he was trying to say. I think, in retrospect, I think what he was trying to say was that money should not be your god when it comes to writing, that it should ultimately be about the art itself. And that's a very noble thing to say. But at the same time, as well, whenever this person, who's quite, is quite a well-known person and has made quite a bit of money from the arts, gets on like that, just not even bothering to pay attention to people who are just starting off, that can leave a very bad taste in the mouth, and it probably put some people off as well because they may have thought, oh, this person's so well known, this person's done this, and they didn't look like they were paying attention. My stuff must be crap, but it wasn't the case at all. It's just that person was just ignorant, and ever since then. Even though I've never met the person since, and I doubt that they would remember that case, I've held a grudge against them because if it had gone another way, I could have easily have internalized that and went, God, my stuff must be crap. And then I could have ended up in a whole fit of self-loathing and then just stopped writing altogether. But thankfully, thankfully I didn't. I was able to carry on. But just little things like that, whenever you're starting off, even if it's, even if you're just trying to be polite, saying like, "Oh, you sounded really good," even if you didn't necessarily like what the person was saying, just the slightest bit of encouragement does go a long way to help an awful lot of people because writing, as you know, is a very personal thing, and then especially an awful lot of people who are just starting off are very self-conscious about their own writing and their own voices and whether they read well, whether the story comes across well. It takes a long time to actually be confident in what you do, and so when you're starting off and someone who's a well-known name gets on like that, it could kill an awful lot of people's confidence. So I say I've never forgiven him for that. And the fact that, as you say, that with me and McGugan, even though it's in one hand it did, it was a nice compliment for her to say, "Well, it's very you." There is a part of you that still made me think, well, God, that she's another famous poet. She doesn't like what I do, but it's just you have to sort of try and internalize, sort of train yourself to sort of not internalize these things. And unfortunately, some people, for whatever reason, either they can't do it or it takes them a long time to do so. And by its point, who knows how many great voices in literature that we've lost because, some someone and didn't necessarily get what they were trying to do. I mean, I'm not. I mean, I could be in the same. I could be casting dispersions on someone who I don't necessarily get, who could then go on to change the face of writing forever. That doesn't necessarily mean I was wrong, but it doesn't necessarily mean I was right either. Just I didn't respond to it. But if you're
Just
young, but
like
what I'm, I guess what I'm trying to get at is if you're young and you're still trying to find your own voice, you tend to take these things personally. So sometimes the slightest thing will send you down a completely different path, and it could end up just sort of either wrecking you destroying your own voice, or you just end up even more sort of embittered.
right. You're right. Yeah, I think that's definitely the way it is. And that's exactly, I mean, that was the nature of the Facebook wars, the Facebook poetry wars in those days, was it was people talking about other people. And I think that the people that I was involved with that were guilty of that have grown up and they're not that way anymore. And there was several cycles of that. And I don't expect to see it again, because there's too much other places to spread your word and not get bogged down. I'm amazed at the number of people who call themselves a poet, for example, on TikTok, for example, and some of it's pretty freaking good, you know.
Hmm.
Um, so you sometimes you got to dig, and you got to dig in different places maybe than what you're used to. And that's kind of why we're here, is we want to be that place where you find things that you're not used to. And I think your book fits that perfectly. Your ideas about writing, your focus, your drive, your process, everything is ideal. And I think much can be learned by the masses um, when uh, when they take the time to pay attention. So we will promote the heck out of this, make sure they do. Do
Thank
this
you.
for me, Christopher. I need you to tell the folks where we can find you. Give us a link to buy the book, and I'll include all the same information in the description as well. And that way people can just click and get the book.
Sure thing. So if you want to find me on social media, if you're on Facebook, you can just find me at if you just type in facebook.com/Owens author, you should find me there. If you're on X or Twitter, as I still call it, you can find me at Mr. Owens 212. Instagram is Mr. Owens 212. And if you've ventured out into the realms of Blue Sky, I'm also Mr. Owens 212 out there. And you can buy the books. You can buy my books on Amazon. The new one, as I say, is Soineanta Maskirovka. You can look it up on any section, any Amazon website, and I'll be certain to send the link on to you, Jack, for promotion. So it should be available. The link should be available in the description.
Yeah, the link will be in the description. If you'll send it to me, I will try to also put it into my bookshop. Um, Amazon's been acting weird lately. Sometimes it'll add the book and find it, and sometimes it won't. So I can't promise that, but I will try to put it in our bookshop so it'll be available there as well.
That's
And
great. Thank you.
I'll include the Amazon link as well for those that might prefer Amazon, whoever the hell that might be. But anyway, we'll see what we can do. But um, look forward to seeing the book, ladies and gentlemen. You need to take a gander at this one. Dig in a little bit deep. Put on your thinking caps. This is a different kind of write for a different kind of read because you're on a journey, and I hope that you'll enjoy it. Chris, have you got anything else?
Yes, there are several other writers who, well, we've spoken off air that are doing, say, great work at the moment. And as I say, one of them is Craig Podmore, who's got a new book out. There's a guy called Jonathan Trainer, who's got a book out from Belfast, who's got a book out called Race the Undead, which is a sort of post-apocalyptic zombie novel set in the north of Ireland, which it works on a few different levels. And you've got some of the guys in Pig Roast Publishing who are doing great work with people like Lisa Carver and the guy, well, I think it's the guy who runs it, the guy from Arabon Radar. And so there's just all I can just suggest you whenever, obviously, once you've bought all my books, start checking out other indie books as well, because the mainstream, even though there will always be, interesting books in the mainstream, the real interesting stuff is on underground, and that's the stuff that you're really going to make you think.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And I'm happy to make that available to you guys. And I appreciate you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming and hanging out with me and Christopher. We're going to close up the shop for today. Please make sure to reach out and touch if you have questions, comments, arguments. Don't forget to subscribe and like and do whatever you can do with our YouTube, with the podcast. I'll include links to our community as well. And if you'll join all the above and wave hi, you never know. You might get a postcard one day that has special hand done art by the Emotional Orphan. So and you can find his work on Redbubble under the Emotional Orphan. That's me, by the way. So thanks, ladies and gentlemen, for being here. We're going to stop the recording now, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Take care.